Hey there, I'm Brittany Smith, and welcome to Filmmaker Symposium. Have you ever wondered why certain films evoke certain emotions and others don't? Well, it turns out that there are objective theories on why certain films impact us and others do not. While music, dialogue, and acting can play a part in the emotions of a story, it's actually not the crux of why we emote when we're watching a movie. So in order to engage your audience emotionally, we want to engage them with empathy rather than sympathy. So sympathy, an example of that would be if your friend's dog dies. If your friend's dog dies, you're going to feel sympathy for your friend, or hopefully you feel sympathy, but you're going to feel sorry for your friend, but you're not necessarily going to feel their pain. But empathy is actually when you feel your friend's pain. So empathy is a little bit deeper and a little bit different than sympathy. Now, in order to create empathy in your story, there are many different ways in which you can go about that. But one of the greatest ways that you can do this is by creating two fears in your character. Now, these two fears have to be opposing to each other and have to lead in different directions. So, for instance, let's take It's a Wonderful Life. So George Bailey is someone who wants to travel. So he has a fear of missing out on traveling the world and experiencing the world. But then, on the other hand, there's the aspect that Mr. Potter might take over his father's bank and might even take over the town. So there's this fear of Mr. Potter changing the town and making it into something that is undesirable. So he's he's pulled between these two things, and there's some tension there in his own internal emotions. So when we see this tension, we're a little bit more emotionally involved now because we can identify with that conflict of trying to figure out, which side do I take? I really want to travel, but I also really don't want Mr. Potter to take over the town. So by setting up this form of empathy, the writer of It's a Wonderful Life actually engages our emotions a little bit more, so that as we go through the journey with George Bailey, by the end of the movie, some of us are crying because we just are so happy that he has come to the conclusion of the wonderful life that he has. So if we want to emotionally engage our audience, we're going to have to understand that there are two very basic emotions that we feel every single day. So those two basic emotions are pleasure and pain. Now, they might intermingle a little bit, but there are two basic emotions. And there might be other emotions that we feel like grief or sorrow or anger or joy or romance, whatever it might be. There's going to be two different emotions that these other emotions fit into. Now, in order to create an emotion in your audience, you want to make sure that you have change. And what I mean by change is making sure that your character has some sort of change from positive to negative in regards to their state or condition. So, for instance, with George Bailey from It's a Wonderful Life, at the end, he goes through a major change. This is the climax, in which he realizes that his life that he thought was actually worthless is in fact wonderful. This is a huge change in his state and condition. And through a series of events that the writer takes us through, or the filmmaker, we end up feeling an emotion at the end as we see this major change take place. So emotion goes hand in hand with change. Now, one big thing we need to remember as we're creating emotions in our timeline of our story is to make sure that we're not doing the same emotion all in a row. So for instance, if we have 3 different scenes that have a negative emotion in each scene, you're going to start boring your audience. Because there's a principle called the law of diminishing returns. So for instance, if you're eating a piece of candy, it's delightful the first time. If you eat a second piece of candy, it's probably moderately delightful. If you eat a third piece of candy, you're going to start feeling the sugar high and maybe not feel so great. So there's a principle here of making sure that you're not doing the same exact thing over and over and over again, or you'll bore your audience. So when you're writing your story, you want to alternate the negative and positive emotions. Make sure that you don't have a set of 3 scenes that have the same emotion. Maybe change it up a little bit, put negative, positive, negative. That way your audience is feeling like there's more variety. So one of the really big mistakes that amateur filmmakers make is thinking that emotion is developed by the music or the acting, the set design, or the cinematography. Now, all those things can have emotion in them as an art form in and of themselves. So for instance, music is a very emotional art form, but it won't produce any emotion in your story because that is not what produces emotion for story. What produces emotion in story is going to be a change in your character's state or condition. Now, here's an example. Let's say a young man graduates from college and he's hoping for his dream job. So he goes for a job interview for his dream job. He ends up getting the dream job, and then because he's making lots of money, he goes out and buys a Ferrari, buys a mansion, gets married, starts a family, and lives happily ever after. So first of all, that story is absolutely terrible because it's going from positive to positive. And we're not going to feel any emotion from that story because there's no change going on with the character. He went from hoping for his dream job to getting the dream job. So it's positive to positive. It's not very interesting. But let's say the amateur filmmaker says, hey, well, since there's no emotion, let's go ahead and add some really cool dramatic music. So you add that really cool cinematic music and you're hoping for your audience to emote. Do you think that the audience is actually going to respond emotionally to this story now? The answer is no. The audience is going to actually think you're kind of silly because you've got this really silly story with this really cool music. So the emotion comes from the story. Even if you have this really cool emotional music, it's not going to help your story emotionally, and it's not going to help your audience feel what your character is feeling. And that's where the difference between emotions and feelings come in. So emotion is something that is a change in your character, but a feeling is something that provides atmosphere to that emotion. So those two together can be very powerful. If you do have a change that's very dramatic and cinematic, that creates a certain emotion in your audience, and you have it coupled with some really great music, you're going to have some really great emotion and really great feeling coming from the film. But music on its own is not going to help your film. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you have any questions or comments about how to engage an audience emotionally, be sure to let me know in the comments section below. Also, be sure to subscribe and like because I want to see you next time on Filmmaker Symposium.